Have you ever been reading a web page and about 30 seconds after you arrived, a subscription form popped up over the top of the content you were reading? It can be kind of irritating, but it can also be a very effective way to build your email list. Today I'm going to show you how you can use TriggerNote to add a delayed display subscription form to your website. In the TriggerNote control panel, we'll create a new trigger set and we'll use the delayed hover recipe. This recipe asks for three things. The first one is the delay time between when the page loads and when the hover message is displayed. The time is specified in milliseconds, which is thousandths of a second, so 30,000 is 30 seconds. To keep this demo a little shorter, I'll change that to 2 seconds. Next is the URL from which to load the content of the hover message. And I'll show you the file that I'm using, hover.html. As you can see, it just contains a simple subscription form. Finally, we'll enter the width of our hover message, and for the subscription form that I'm displaying, 320 pixels is about right. And then when we apply the recipe, it creates a whole bunch of code, which fortunately you don't need to know anything about. We'll just give our trigger set a name, save it, and we'll copy the ID number of our trigger set and paste it into a web page. Now if I reload the page, after 2 seconds our hover message is displayed. You can find a lot of the details of how TriggerNote displays the message in some of my other videos, but in this one I'm just going to quickly go over a few key points that you'll need to know if you want to change any of those settings that you first applied when we applied the recipe. First of all, this recipe sets up a trigger group with 3 triggers. The click trigger handles the click on the X icon up in the corner of the hover box, which closes the hover box. The JavaScript variable trigger is the one that actually displays the hover box, although it doesn't control the delay time before the hover box is displayed. What it does is it checks whether a variable named TriggerNoteInitted, or TriggerNoteInitialized, is equal to 1. The reason that we do this is that while TriggerNote is setting up all of its scripts as the page loads, TriggerNoteInitted is set to 0. During that setup process, TriggerNote will ask this JavaScript variable trigger, "Are you ready to trigger or not?" And since TriggerNoteInitted is 0, it will say, "No, I'm not ready," which will prevent the hover box from being displayed as the page loads. Once everything is initialized, TriggerNoteInitted is automatically set to 1, so that after our delay time, when this trigger is asked again, "Are you ready to trigger?" then it will say yes, and the hover box will be displayed. So let me show you how we trigger this after the delay time has passed. Our recipe gave this trigger a unique trigger ID, which is TriggerNote delay hover and then a big long number. And if we look in the onload trigger, you'll see that the first action is an execute JavaScript code action. And the JavaScript code that it's going to execute is the TriggerNote trigger, whose ID is TriggerNote delayed hover and that big long number. You can also use this action to execute any JavaScript code that you want, either by entering a function name or by entering the JavaScript code itself, here where I've entered this trigger ID. In the delay time field, we have 2000 milliseconds, or 2 seconds, which is the delay time that we specified when we applied the recipe. So what this action does is, as the page is loading, it sets a 2-second timer, after which it tells TriggerNote to trigger that other trigger which actually displays the hover image. Now, there are a bunch of other things that happen during this onload trigger. For example, we create the TriggerNote page cover, which is the gray background that covered the rest of the screen, and we create the box and other things like that. And if we scroll down a little bit, you find this action, set HTML element style, which sets the width of that hover box to 320 pixels like we specified. If you need to tweak the width of your hover box, this is the place to do that. And then finally at the bottom we have a load URL into JavaScript variable action, which is loading that file hover.html. And so if you want to change the URL that you're loading, this would be the place to do that. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to check out some of my other videos to see some of the many other ways that TriggerNote can help make your website more dynamic and interactive.